So it's been around 2 years since our last foray into the MCU with Spider-Man Homecoming, and before that came the comic book movie epic that was Avengers Endgame. There were many fans out there, myself included, who saw Endgame as, well, the Endgame, the finale to one of the greatest and most lucrative film franchises in cinematic history. While there were future films announced, such as the Black Widow film, which I'm sure that we will get to see sometime in the 2050s, if Disney and Marvel wanted to stop it at Endgame and Homecoming, I honestly wouldn't have complained. It felt like an appropriate conclusion. I came out of those movies totally satisfied, not only with Phase 3 of Marvel, but with the MCU in general. It didn't seem like there was anywhere else to go. Continuing the story of any of the Avengers, whether in film form or TV form, just kind of felt redundant. I was worried that any attempt to carry this thing further would end up sinking the entire ship, like it would be one of those franchises where we'd go, oh yeah, that MCU, it was so great, it was so fun, until they kept it going longer than they should have. But now that Wandavision has aired in its entirety, I can say without any question or shadow of doubt that it is not only a tremendous addition to the MCU, but it might well be one of the most touching and emotionally charged stories they've told. Also, yes, this video is going to feature heavy spoilers, so run away if you haven't seen the whole thing. A big criticism of the MCU has been its tendency to recycle and repeat plot lines without injecting much innovation in the story. Doctor Strange is effectively a retread of Iron Man. Thor 2 basically does nothing to advance from Thor 1, and even repeats the whole Loki's dead, psych, no he's not thing from the first film. Luckily, Marvel has done a good job of listening to these criticisms, with many of their weirder, and some might say riskier, endeavors paying off big time. Thor Ragnarok was a huge departure from the previous Thor films in terms of the tone, the script, and the aesthetic. Infinity War took a massive leap by having the bad guy, spoiler alert, win at the end. And now we have WandaVision, which is probably the weirdest thing that Marvel has ever put out there, and this is from the same franchise which gave us...
Did you just say the Grandmaster used it for orgies?
Yeah. Don't touch anything.
WandaVision isn't the type of thing you could see Marvel doing towards the beginning of its cinematic universe, and in that, it is nice to see just how far they've come. I'm glad that they are giving themselves permission to tell weirder and wackier, and, for lack of a better term, more comic booky stories. But more important than that, I'm glad that Marvel and Disney are taking the opportunity to tell stories with more intimacy, with more character and more depth. On the surface level, it seems like WandaVision is just doing the usual MCU shtick. Superpowered hero, trapped in a wacky situation, bad guys here and there, trying to stop them or kill them, they get themselves out of it through some big bombastic action, the end. But really, at its core, the show is about much more than just that. There is some pretty heavy themes in here for a company like Marvel to tackle, and the fact that they can do it in such a mature, bizarre, yet ultimately Marvel-esque way is kind of astounding to me. I would argue that Wanda Maximoff is one of the MCU's most interesting and underutilized heroes, and after watching WandaVision I use the term hero very, very loosely. I mean, think about it, she suffered time and again just as badly as any of the main heroes, yet she's always remained in the background, she's never been the center of attention. Well, now here is her chance, and big surprise, she absolutely steals the show. Literally. But what makes this such an interesting subversion of the typical Marvel formula is that this isn't really a continuation of a superhero story. It's ultimately a supervillain's origin story. WandaVision casts Wanda as the central villain while keeping her as the main protagonist. When you find out what she's doing to this town and to these people, basically putting them en masse into the sunken place from Get Out.
Dude, what the fuck?
And I love that they commit to that. They don't do the easy thing that I thought they were going to do by having the mystery villain be the actual mastermind behind everything. That's what I was worried about with the whole... I mean, that's a tune, and Agatha's a great antagonist, but I didn't like the idea that she was the one that was actually puppeteering everything. I appreciate that the showrunners stuck to their guns and made Wanda the one doing all of this terrible stuff to these innocent people. It takes guts to have one of your main heroes go down this incredibly twisted path. There is no justifiable excuse for what Wanda is doing here, and even by the end she doesn't achieve any kind of redemption. All she does is let her victims go and then bolts. She doesn't stay to face any consequences, she doesn't confess her guilt and turn herself into the authorities. The implication of the final shot is that she's teaching herself how to grow even stronger. How else are we supposed to see that other than a Marvel equivalent of Tom Riddle learning about the dark arts? Ultimately, Wanda descending into such a villainous state is the point of the show. Villains are typically written with tragic and traumatic backstories, but we rarely ever actually see it play out, especially in Marvel films. Sometimes we watch those tragic backstories play out on screen during the film, see Loki discovering his true heritage in the first Thor, but ultimately the villain's story always takes a backseat to the heroes. What we see in most superhero films is the end result of trauma and tragedy. In WandaVision, we're seeing the steps leading up to this as the villain's story takes center stage for 9 full episodes. We see Wanda's pain after losing her parents, losing her brother, being forced to kill her love only to watch him die again right before her eyes. Anyone who's been through or known someone who's been through a traumatic loss, let alone multiple losses, knows the kind of behavior that can bring out in the victim. Such a painful experience changes you, it warps you, it twists you into someone completely different from who you were before said event. And it can be just as painful getting out of that mindset as getting into it in the first place. This transformation from tragic but strong hero to broken evildoer is at the heart of WandaVision's story. Upon giving the show a second watch, it really did strike me how every single element serves to convey that central theme. It just does it in a very unconventional and slightly unsettling way. The pocket dimension that Wanda creates for herself seems all cute at first, it's kind of like a nice callback to classic sitcoms, but when you find out that all of it is a manifestation of her refusal to come to terms with her loss, it takes on a whole new meaning. Those fake ads seem like fun homages to classic sitcoms, but when you find out the deeper significance that they're trying to hide...
Wanda, teorin, die pan wodę zajście.
Yeah, it suddenly becomes super uncomfortable, doesn't it? Also, as a quick aside, I do want to give all the praise in the world to the showrunners for doing such a masterful job recreating every kind of sitcom from the 50s to modern day. You could tell they did their research. I mean, just the dialogue, to the sets, to the costume design, to the way that the episodes were shot in that 4:3 aspect ratio. Even the ads felt like they were taken directly from the time period that they were satirizing.
They say a man is never fully dressed without 2 important accessories: his special lady and his strucker.
Benign 1960s sexism. Don Draper would be proud. Hell, to a lot of Marvel's younger audiences, it's probably something of an education. Like, yeah, this is the kind of stuff people thought was funny back in those days, kids.
The coons are coming.
Then again, our generation did have the Big Bang Theory, so... Everything we see Wanda do in those first few episodes expresses just how desperate she is to deny reality and cling to this false world she has built for herself, but you wouldn't entirely get that upon the first viewing. I remember seeing so much confusion online when the first few episodes aired, just like, what's going on here? What's happening? Who's doing this? Is it Wanda? Is it Hydra? Is that Evan Peters Quicksilver actually Mephisto? What the hell? Part of that is the brilliant marketing on Disney's part. I mean, you release episodes of a show week by week, you get more views and more internet chatter than you would if you just released it all at once for people to binge. And while that is an effective media strategy, it also helped build the uneasy mystery belying the heart of WandaVision. As the episodes went by, we had no idea what was going on, exactly like the characters we were watching. The inhabitants of Westfield didn't know what was happening around them thanks to Wanda's mind control. The agents of S.W.O.R.D. outside the town, they didn't have a clue. Even Wanda herself didn't have a full picture of what she was doing. That's just the sheer power of her denial. The show takes advantage of your ignorance and uses that to pull you into its deeper mysteries. Only when the final episode aired and we got the complete picture did we know what everything meant. And now that we have that knowledge, we can go back to those earlier episodes and suddenly realize the significance of the smaller details. That's part of the reason WandaVision's mystery element was so brilliant. It was easier for a large section of the internet to believe an outside villain was doing all of this instead of considering the plain and simple fact that No, Wanda, our hero, was behind it the whole time. That's definitely a big departure from the kinds of stories we see in the MCU. We are not encouraged to sympathize with the villain in a lot of our media, especially our comic book movies, but WandaVision stands as an example of a more modern trend of sympathizing with our devils, in that it shares a lot of similarities with movies like Joker, where we find empathy with the main character before or while they are falling down the rabbit hole of villainy. Except where in Joker, mental illness and an indifferent society created our villain, in WandaVision it's, well, grief. At its heart, this is a story about grief, Wanda's grief. She goes through all the usual stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. Most people know about these stages through cultural osmosis, but if you talk to any psychiatrist, they'll tell you that dealing with grief is almost never a simple straight line. Wanda spends most of the show in a state of denial and intermittently pops in and out of the other stages. She begins the show in denial about her loss, clinging to the false reality she's made for herself in order to live with a version of her dead hubby. She breaks into fits of anger whenever this false reality is questioned. She bargains with herself by telling those outside of her ideal reality to back off before then expanding the boundaries of her false reality. We even get Agatha bargaining with her in an effort to keep her in that state of denial. She falls down into a depression when her dead hubby begins to learn the truth, and then she finally reaches acceptance when she defeats Agatha, collapses her false reality, and lets Vision go. This final step is especially painful as Wanda is also having to surrender the make-believe children that she and Vision had together. She's not only accepting that the love of her life is gone, but that the possibility of any family that they might have had together is gone too. Wanda is forced to relive her past traumas by Agatha. She's even offered a deal to remain in that state of bliss at the expense of losing her powers and keeping a whole town mentally enslaved. But only when she rejects this deal, stops lying to herself, stops trying to bargain for some artificial happiness, and realizes what she's done, is she able to finally find some sense of closure. Wanda saying goodbye to Vision and letting her false reality collapse is the purest expression of her reaching that final stage of acceptance. She's not redeemed by any stretch of the imagination, and I think it will be more interesting to see her travel further down that path of darkness, and ultimately this show has demonstrated that the MCU's still got plenty of life in it. There are tons more interesting stories to tell, but that's not really the point of this show. Yes, it does exist to set up the whole Doctor Strange multiverse of madness thing, and probably a host of other MCU properties, but the main point of WandaVision is to demonstrate the destructive powers of grief and loss and trauma, how these things can tear us apart and warp our sense of self, how they can turn our heroes into our villains.